So good morning, everyone. We today have Denise Ellsworth. She is speaking on bees in your Ohio backyard. Denise Ellsworth is the program director of the Honeybee and Native Pollinator Education at the Ohio State Department of Entomology. Denise directs the Honeybee and Native Pollinator Education program through Ohio State University Department of Entomology on the Worcester campus. In this outreach position, Denise supports and teaches beekeepers, farmers, gardeners, and others across the state through a variety of workshops, webinars, written materials, and electronic resources. In addition to chasing bees, Denise enjoys gardening, yoga, photography, and hiking the towpath trail along the Tuscarawas River with her husband and dogs. Please welcome Denise Ellsworth and give us a warm Wild Ones welcome. Thank you, Denise. I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks. So happy to be here. You didn't falter over Tuscarawas. Not everybody can pronounce my favorite river. So it's so nice to be with everyone this morning. I have a couple things to tell you about, and one is that I'm in my empty old office. We have a new building that's been built on the Worcester campus. The reason I had to come to Worcester is that my husband has his vaccine appointment this morning, so I have to hop in the car pretty much right at 11:05 and speed off so we can get him a shot in the arm, which I'm very thrilled about, as you can relate. And so one of my challenges is, well, it may seem a little hollow for one thing. And I also don't have my, what I usually have, my second screen. And so I apologize, but I need to keep the presenter format up just so I can kind of keep on time and kind of head the direction that I'd like to go. So usually I would shut that off and just have you see the main slide, but I think we'll be okay. You can bear with me there. So, and I have my talk split into kind of two parts. The first part, we're going to talk about some of the projects in Ohio that are helping us get a feel for where bees are and what bees we have. And then I'm actually going to pull up a second PowerPoint that I made just for this group, talking about how to make a bee watcher's garden, focusing on native plants. So we'll end up with that. Okay. And Holly, if I have, if there are key questions that you see in the chat box that it would be helpful for me to answer to clarify, I'm happy to do that. And time permitting, I'm happy to take questions at the end, or you can follow up with me if we don't have time for a lot of questions.
Wonderful.
Okay. So when we talk about pollinators, most of our pollinators are insects. We do have hummingbirds that can be pollinators in Ohio. Our bats aren't pollinators, but we have all kinds of insects that serve the role of taking pollen from flower to flower. But our primary pollinators are bees. We're not sure how many species we have in Ohio. I usually say somewhere between 400 and 450. We're not exactly sure. And that's really one of our quests, is to figure out, we can't conserve what we don't know about. So we're trying to get a handle on which bee species do we have across the state, where are they, and which ones are needing some conservation attention. So our attention really turned to bees in 2017 when the rusty patch bumblebee was added to the endangered species list, our first bee in the continental US to be listed. And we wanted to know, is this bee still in Ohio? It used to be part of the range of this bee, Ohio, but it hadn't been widely seen for about 20 years. And so Karen Goodell, you probably know about the bee survey. Karen Goodell, who's a professor at OSU Newark, and Randy Mitchell, professor at University of Akron, came together with their graduate students and undergrads and postdocs to form the bee team, whose goal it was to scour lots and lots of Ohio, looking as best they could for the rusty patch bumblebee, but also inventorying other bumbles that they saw across the state, as well as which flowers those bumbles visited. Kind of a side project of that was the development of the Ohio Bee Atlas, because even though Randy and Karen have a great team, and they could really get to a lot of places, they obviously couldn't get everywhere. And so they wanted the help of community scientists. And so we developed this project on iNaturalist, the Ohio Bee Atlas. What happens is that probably lots of you use iNaturalist, and if you don't, please add it to your phone. Maybe while we're talking, create yourself a free account. It's such a neat tool, and I'm going to use it a lot in this talk this morning. So we created this project, the Honeybee Atlas, so that any observations, pictures that people take of bees anywhere in Ohio automatically get filtered into our project. So you don't have to join the project to have a picture of a bee come to us. And this is a current screenshot of, as of yesterday, we had 26,000 observations in 172 different species. So we know we have a lot more species than that, but if you know about bee identification, and many of you are bee students, we've been in programs together, you know that it's really hard to identify bees, and that sometimes we have to actually have the bee under a microscope with some species. So we actually need to examine for example, the male genitalia or some really specific and small microscopic details that we just can't do out in the field or with a photograph. But there is a lot that we can tell from photographs. And so we started to train folks to go out, either take pictures of bees on flowers or capture them in a Ziploc bag or with a net or in a pill bottle, take a picture and post that to iNaturalist. So we've had a lot of fun interacting with folks, helping them learn to use iNaturalist. If you know iNaturalist, you know that it's good for anything living or formerly living. You put that image up into iNaturalist and experts weigh in and help to identify that observation, and then you get this kind of life list on your phone. So again, I would really encourage you to start to use iNaturalist. Here in our project, the Ohio Bee Atlas, if you click, there's so many tools at iNaturalist. So if you click on species, what iNaturalist does is give you a list kind of from, for reading down here from left to right, the most commonly observed bee in our project. So that isn't to say that it's the most common bee in Ohio, but our focus was bumblebees. So we have a lot of bumblebee observations, but this does tell you which bees were most commonly observed in this project. So the common eastern bumblebee, the western honeybee, the eastern Carpenter bee, down to, you imagine the scroll going down to 172 bees, bees that may only have one or two observations that have been made. So I like this tool because if you're trying to learn bee identification, why not start with the most commonly observed bees, right? These are the ones we're more likely to see. Maybe they're larger, they have more easily identified characteristics to help us figure out who they are. Another thing that you can do is you can click on observations. So let me go back to this image. This is from yesterday. I clicked on observations and it does kind of the same thing, but in a chronological order, which are the most recently observed bees in Ohio in this project. And so western honeybees have been seen in the last, this is 3 days prior to yesterday, 4 days ago. Little spring mining bees are out, a little pure green sweat bee, an Agochlora, and a queen bumblebee. So again, wherever you are or wherever you're going, you could put in the location. Let's say you're going to Cincinnati and you want to know what bees to look for. You could put this into the project, have it pull up what's been seen there. And you can do this with flowers or trees or whatever you're interested in with iNaturalist. So one thing that I love to do pre-pandemic times is gather with folks in meadows and fields with nets and cameras and vials and try to get a feel for, what are we seeing? What bees are out there? Here we are at Pollinator Palooza at Franklin Park Conservatory. There's Danita. Hey, Danita, you're on the call too. Maybe Ken's there. And Becky up at Holden Arboretum. Lots of different folks are community scientists helping with this project. This is Lydia. She's part of the Buzz Troop at the Cincinnati Zoo, which is a group of teen volunteers. They check out a camera from the horticulture department at the zoo, and then they go and take pictures of any insects that they see on flowers. So they're actually one of our most prolific observers, kind of a congregate group there down at the zoo. And some of those students have actually developed quite an interest in photography and in insects, and we hope to have some of them at OSU studying entomology. Here, just an idea of some of the information you can glean from iNaturalist. So if you click on, here I've got the two-spotted bumblebee, here's what do we have here? Bombus gris, the brown-belted bumblebee, Bombus impatiens. And I can get a little phenology chart, which is just so cool. I can see, when am I most likely to see this bee out in the field? And with this Bombus impatiens, we see this little dip here, this little rise in spring, and then not so many, and then lots more. And these are the queens, right? So again, we can kind of get a feel. When am I likely to see this bee across the state? Unfortunately, all that work, we tried hard to find the rusty patch bumblebee. We didn't find it in Ohio, but it has been found in neighboring states. In West Virginia, there have been a few sightings. It's in Virginia. It's well established in Minnesota and Wisconsin, as well as Illinois. So we hope to be able to figure out what are some of the issues surrounding the rusty patch bumblebee. We don't really know if it's a habitat issue, a parasite issue. Why was this decline so serious? Possibly pathogens in Ohio. One of our last observations actually was from Dr. Randy Mitchell. This bee was observed in 1997. He submitted the observation in 2016, and it's from a bee that a student had collected in a class there at University of Akron. So if you're from any of these parts of the state, there are a lot of historical sightings of the rusty patch. So, particularly down here, close to the West Virginia border, in higher elevations, maybe some cooler places, we're hoping one of you might help us find the rusty patch. We hope it's still in the state. So after the bee survey, well, maybe you know about Melissa Spring, pictured there on the left, who for 3 years headed the Ohio Dragonfly survey. Melissa is an alum of the Entomology department. And once the Dragonfly survey finished, I just want to point out that they way whooped us in observations, 90,000 dragonfly observations, but dragonflies sit still a lot better than bees do. But they had 156 species that they identified. So Melissa was able to come on to Dr. Karen Goodell's lab. She's now based out of out of Newark, and she's heading the statewide bee survey. So the Ohio Bee Survey uses, and I know some of you probably participated in this bee survey. It just started last year, and it's funded in part by ODNR, and along with some general funders that helped get us kicked off last year. So this is a project that uses bee bowls, these little colored cups that you see here pictured in this collection box. They're blue, yellow, and white painted on the inside, specific colors that make these cups look like, when they're filled with soapy water, they look like bright flowers full of nectar. It's a tricky thing to do to a bee. They come in, they get caught, they can't get out because of the soap has broken the tension on the water. They drown in the cup, and then the collectors go out and after 24 hours collect all the bees, filter them out, and then froze those bees once a week and sent them eventually back to Melissa in Newark. So one of the things that Melissa does, she's really a very talented communicator. And once a week, she sends out to anyone who subscribes to this blog. You don't have to be part of that survey, out there putting out the bee bowls. You can get her update, and you learn so much. She's really great at sharing pictures under the microscope and kind of explaining how this fly is different from that fly. It wasn't just bees, all the bycatch. So anybody else in the bowls was added to that wealth of data. So the spiders all went to someone studying spiders. The flies were passed on to someone studying flies. And so we've been sure to make good use of all that scientific data. But so far she has identified, along with her undergrads who are helping to pin all these specimens, over 14,000 bees. 14,000 bees, so that's a lot of bees. Some of the bees are, as I said earlier, very difficult to identify. It can take Melissa, who is an expert, an hour under a high-powered microscope, working through keys to figure out the identity of that bee. So don't feel bad if you're a little perplexed. by Bee ID. It's definitely a skill. It's like anything. It helps if you have sharp eyes and a good logical understanding to work through a key, for example, but also practice, practice, practice. So here's a web location if you want to subscribe to that blog. You can go back and look at past updates that Melissa has shared, and she shares some, here I highlighted how they sort the specimens and before they get to pinning. She's done some videos and posted them. So again, kudos to Melissa for doing such a great job of organizing this project, but also she's very generous to share what she knows and help other people learn along with her. So those are some OSU projects happening. There are some broader projects that have to do with bees that you might want to get involved with. This Bumblebee Watch is a national project. It's very similar to iNaturalist. In fact, all the bees that are entered in iNaturalist filter along with Bumblebee Watch observations to a greater database. So whether you use iNaturalist or Bumblebee Watch, those observations are available to researchers who are studying these different critters. So Bumblebee Watch, you can learn more about how to identify bumblebees. It is bumblebee specific, obviously. But what we might start to see here soon, in fact, maybe wherever you are in the state, you've already seen a queen bumblebee. This is a project called Queen Quest, because what happens with bumblebees, unlike honeybees, they have an annual life cycle. So the only way bumblebees survive the winter is that one queen from that will start a new colony. She digs down 10 to 12 inches underground and just hangs out for the winter. So we don't know a lot about where they hibernate, when they come out, what their triggers are, and that's because they're so difficult to track and find. Even the nests are hard, but the hibernacula are even harder. And so Queen Quest asks folks to let them know when they're seeing queen bumblebees. Are you seeing them looking for nesting sites? Maybe in your garden you've unearthed one. They're trying to gather that data. And this image is, the reason we should all be growing crocuses, right? Here's just one little patch of purple crocus, and it happens to have attracted 4 queen bumblebees. These are all Bombus impatiens, our common eastern bumblebee. Look how big and fat she is. That's one way you know it's a queen, also because only the queens are out in spring until about mid-spring, maybe mid-May, depending on where you are in the state. And then you see the workers that are much smaller. So put crocus on your fall. I know it's not native, but sure is a great rest stop for these queens who emerge from their winter hibernation. They burn through a lot of their fat reserve and they need that nectar, and then they gather that pollen to start the colony. To learn more about bees, Melissa Spring has taken Sam Drogy's guide to Maryland. So Sam Drogy and others developed this wonderful bee guide to Maryland bees. And Melissa and some others pulled together this Ohio field guide, which is a free PDF. Amy Schnebelen was really great at adding photos and doing the graphic layout so that this is a beautiful full color guide, a free PDF. So you'll want to check that out. And it lives among other places on the Bee Lab website. So if you look for belab.osu.edu, that's the OSU Bee Lab. Under native bees, under this tab, I have all these resources, and one of them is this, I've lost track here. Bees of Ohio, sorry, I couldn't remember what the first word was. Bees of Ohio, a field guide for that free PDF. Lots of other resources on there, other fact sheets. We have a poster that is a free PDF if you want to have this printed out, if you have a youth group or a nature center that you want to help people understand about bees. And then we also have a sign up list. So if you join our contact list, you'll find out about programs and webinars. We've been doing a ton of webinars, right, in the last year, and you can find out about those here on our website. So that's the Bee Lab website again. There's my contact, ellsworth.2@osu.edu. So I'm going to take just a pause, and Holly, if you'll let me know if we have any questions kind of from that piece, and I'm going to switch to my other talk.
Yeah, absolutely. That was fabulous. Cecilia had a question about needing a dead insect if a photo ID isn't good enough, and she says that it's been answered. But I think that's something we could talk a little bit about, Denise. I know you use the freezer method in order to just sort of stun the bees. Correct me if I'm wrong, in order to identify.
Okay, so right, so one option that you have, but actually it's the fridge, not the freezer, because the
Sorry.
Okay, let's see. It says my screen share is failed to start. Let me just try to work through that real quick. I stopped sharing, didn't I? Do you still see my screen?
No, I think you can, I think you should be able to screen share.
Yeah, it's not wanting to let me do that. It's failed again. Sorry, guys. Let's just see what we can do here. Let me just share my desktop. Maybe that'll work. Did that work?
Yes.
Okay, you see my messy desktop. It's even worse behind there. Hide your children. Play from current slide. Presenter view. Okay. Okay, so yes, to identify bees, you can use a chilled bee. You can't use a frozen bee unless you want to kill the bee, which is a good option to humanely euthanize the bee, is to put it in the freezer. But you can just chill bees down in the fridge for, it's going to take a good hour. Depends how big the bee is. The larger bee takes longer to chill. And then they're just very sleepy, right? They're very still. You can look at them closely with the hand lens. You can put them under a dissecting scope. Realize that all the light you add, the heat from that machinery is going to warm them up more quickly. But you could put them back in the fridge, chill them down again. They can actually fare very well that way. And then you just release them when you're done with them. So that's definitely an option. We do that in the field. A lot of my my bee fans who we go around together looking at bees. We carry little lunch coolers with us with ice packs so that we're ready to chill bees down to take a look.
Awesome. Yeah, that's the only question so far. But guys,
Okay.
if you have any questions, go ahead and feel free to put them in the chat as we're moving through.
Okay.
And we'll get to them as soon as we're finished with this. Excited to see the next one.
Awesome. So this was a good, this talk was a good impetus for me to work on this idea I've had for a while. I really wanted to develop this idea of a bee watcher's garden, because I have my favorite plants that I go to when I'm trying to find different bees. Now, this isn't to say that this is the best forage source for that bee, but it's a place where I go. It's a plant where I go that pretty sure I'm going to see a lot of polyester bees, Calides on redbud, for example. So when I see the redbuds blooming, I'm out there looking for polyester bees. So I thought, we don't have a lot of time together this morning, and Holly asked me to do kind of a look at bee phenology. So which bees are active at different times throughout the year. And I thought, well, let's do this bee watcher's garden and talk about some of the different plants that you could have in your garden. Or, oops, I got to move this, right? You're seeing all my screen. So let me move this out of the way. There.
Just seeing the presenter view, Denise. It looks
good. Okay. Okay. Awesome. Good. Thank you. So it did click somehow. So these are some of the plants that I suggest that you have in your garden or close by if you want to watch a lot of bees, right? If we're trying to have a bird watcher's garden, we're going to have lots of plants that attract birds, like serviceberry or others that are, millet, or others that are good food, providing good food for birds. So if we want a bee watcher's garden, what are some of the plants that are a pretty good bet that we're going to see a lot of bees on? So we're going to go through these, our spring bulbs, ephemeral wildflowers, which are blooming for some of you right now, early trees, willows and maples. Don't discount the weeds. Most of these that I've included are natives, but I do have some non-natives too, because they are great forage sources. Our apple and cherry trees, redbud, and then into early summer flowers, monardas and carrot family. Into summer with squash, our heat of the summer natives, lobelia and others, and then some good late season flowers. Okay, so let's take a look at these. And So we do see different bees at different times of the year. As I mentioned, the big queen bumblebee, she's out now. We're going to see her daughters later, and then her drones, her sons, much later in the summer. But other bees have a time of year preference as well. Like mason bees is a very early season bee. They love early fruit crops, and so they're active early in the spring. We don't see them in summer. They're tucked away as little larvae in tunnels and tubes. Here's our polyester bee, also a very early season bee. And then here on the right, this is a longhorn bee that's actually a specialist on ironweed, and we'll talk about what specialist bees are. So hopefully you know about OSU's phenology calendar. If not, this is a great time to learn about that. I thought I had what you need to put in your Google browser is the letters GDD for growing degree day. So just type in GDD. You can do this right now on Google on your phone, GDD, and then give a space and put OSU. And the phenology calendar should be the first choice that comes up. This is a calendar that Dr. Dan Herms developed, and anywhere in Ohio, you put in any Ohio zip code. The default is today's date, but you can put past dates in as well. You say, show me the calendar, and this is basically what the calendar is doing, is giving you plant by plant what should be. So this is the date that I put in. What's above that black bar is what is already in bloom, and what's below that black bar is what's about to bloom. Okay, so just to orient you a little to the calendar if you haven't used it before. These are not all pollinator plants, but many of them are excellent for pollinators. It was really developed as a way to scout for pest species that are active in ornamental landscapes, but it serves as a great tool to kind of learn what's blooming when. Some garden designers use it to have plants blooming at different times throughout the year. It's a good way to predict, natural events. Maybe you're looking at turkey vulture return or red-winged blackbird return, and you track all that in your nature journal. This is a great tool to supplement that observation. Okay, so we're back to the bee watcher's garden, and what I did is I went to iNaturalist and I took observations that people had made that highlight those plants that I mentioned. So we're going to start with our some of our spring bulbs, like this winter aconite. And here's a great big queen, again, bumblebee. And actually this bee was seen on March 8th up here close to Huron, in Huron Township, Ohio. So just some of the ways that you can use iNaturalist to see what's happening where. Those spring ephemerals are another great place to look for bees. And this Dutchman breeches actually has a nice pollinating relationship with queen bumblebees. She'll go and reach in there for nectar and transfer the pollen, but there are some other early bees that might do that as well. And actually, here's a great picture I pulled off a DNR site that shows this beautiful, here's Carol's image, is this queen bumblebee reaching down into those Dutchman's breeches. So lots of our spring ephemerals. Here's an image of a queen. This is a brown belted bumblebee. Can you see her belt there? Probably looking for a nesting site, or maybe gathering some pollen and nectar to take back to provision those cells for those early daughters. So when I see Virginia bluebells, that's when I'm thinking about I'm looking for queen bumblebees. Those are two occurrences that I kind of link together, and that's really the basis of phenology. What's blooming and what other biological events are associated with that, so that your plant can be your indicator for what you may want to be looking for. Another early bee that you may not be so happy to see. So let's look at this. Do you think it's a bumblebee? Well, it says up there. Okay, don't look at the top right, Carpenter bee. So early in the season, that's the easiest time to confuse bumblebees and carpenter bees. They're both very large because the queens are out for the bumblebees. Carpenter bees are always large, but they're about the size of that queen. Some ways that we can tell them apart, and you can just barely get a sense here on this Carpenter bee. She has a shiny hiney, whereas our bumblebees, there's a little shine there, but we have rows of hair here on this abdomen. So bumblebees have fuzzy butts and Carpenter bees have shiny heinies. She also has such a big round head, right? Different than kind of the horsey face that we see with bumblebees. But Carpenter bees are active very early. They actually overwinter as adults, tucked in, you tell me where, in your porch, in your Adirondack chair, in your split rail fence, wherever else they're irritating you by chewing out the wood to make their galleries, to provision cells for their young. So they spend the winter tucked in that wood as adults, just waiting for temperatures to warm up enough. One of the things I love about spring is that usually I go down to the Arc of Appalachia and volunteer for their wildflower pilgrimage. Just a great, I mean, it's a great place to be, and the wildflowers and the bees. And I've really missed, I'll miss 2 seasons now doing that. But I'm sure to see from the distance from my house in Stark County, which is 2 counties south of Cleveland, to the Arc of Appalachia down in Highland, they're much further ahead phenologically, right? When I get there to the Arc of Appalachia in April, the Carpenter bees are buzzing, the honeybees are out, many of our early mining bees, queen bumblebees are everywhere in those rock walls looking for a place to nest, but definitely those Carpenter bees are out. They are a native bee, and they can be a good pollinator. They can buzz pollinate, but they can be destructive as well. So trying to tolerate them in your cedar-sided house is going to be very expensive for you in the end. And so I encourage you to either do what you need to do to restrict them. You paint, you stain, or you do an insecticide repellent on that, so they don't nest there in the first place. They are not compatible with your house. You're going to have to do something. That's my opinion. Okay, so more spring ephemerals. Here's one of our, the flowers we're most delighted to see in the spring beauty. And it actually has this little mining bee that's a specialist. So let's talk about what specialist bees are. So just like monarch caterpillars have to have milkweed, these specialist bee larvae have to have pollen from certain plants. So this mom, this Andrina mom, this specialist mom, only gathers pollen from spring beauties to provision cells in the ground for her young. Okay, she's hardwired to go to that plant. I want you to look and figure out what color spring beauty pollen is. Isn't it just the most beautiful light pink color you've ever seen? It's just so beautiful here tucked. She has hairy armpits and hairy legs, and that's the pollen that she gathers for her offspring. So if you have spring beauties, chances are pretty good you have the spring beauty miner bee around. And so there's it's not the only bee that will visit spring beauties. It's a nice source of pollen and nectar for other bees. But there is that direct association with that specialist bee. And they're about a quarter of all bees are specialist. They have to have certain pollen. Okay. So let's look at another bee that you might actually see on spring beauty. And this one is a nomad bee in the genus Nomada. And some of you who know bees are looking at that one knowingly. Others, if this is a new bee to you, observe, is it very hairy? Is this a very hairy bee, or is it a little more wasp-like? This is actually a bee that we call a kleptoparasite. So it's a parasitic bee that doesn't gather pollen on her own for her young. She uses the nest, the work that another mom has done, in this case, the Andrina mom. Look how fuzzy she is, right? Lots of hairs to gather pollen. This mom takes this pollen back to her tunnel nest in the ground, provisions that cell, may even lay her egg. She's going to come back, maybe tuck a little more pollen in before she seals that little cell. But here's the nomad bee mom. She has watched this Andrina mom. She knows exactly where the nest is. You can see these nomad bees in the forest, and they're not really on flowers so much unless they need a little flight fuel. They're watching the other bees and following them, looking for that tunnel entrance. So when the Andrina mom leaves, the Nomada comes in, places her egg in that tunnel. Her egg hatches out into a larva faster. The Andrina comes back, seals off that cell. She doesn't know that there are two eggs in there. The Nomada egg hatches out first. Typically with these kleptoparasites, they have sickle-like jaws in the first larval stage, so that Nomada baby slices the egg or the larva of the Andrina larva, and so kills the original inhabitant and eats that pollen source. So that's the klepto part. She's stealing, or that offspring, male or female, is stealing that provision. But a cool bee, a neat interaction. And once you start to look, typically the Nomada have black and yellow markings on them. You're going to start to see them. They look a little bit like wasps, but you'll notice the behavior following some of those Andrinas, watching to see where they nest. Okay, so that was some of our spring bulbs and our spring ephemerals. Often we can't plant spring ephemerals, right? We have to take advantage of places like Dawes and other, parks and natural places that have spring ephemerals. We're not so lucky usually in our gardens to have the right soils. But all of us have the right soils for weeds. Maybe you have purple dead nettle in your garden. This is the member of the mint family that is what we call a winter annual. So they like the cool temperatures. That's when they germinate. The seeds germinate in, could be December, January. Mine are up and quite vigorously growing. They're not blooming yet, but they bloom early. This little mint-like lip here on the flower, a nice nectar source. And here's an early mason bee in the genus Osmia. And you can see she has her head down in here. So she was drinking some nectar, but look how the color of her head. So we have orange pollen then on this purple dead nettle. So purple dead nettle is a weed. It's a non-native. It's the weed that turns fields this cast of purple in the spring. So you know it when you see it. And there are a lot of bees that take advantage of that early nectar and pollen source. And in this case, an osmia. The mason bees, osmias, the females have hairs on their bellies. They have hairy undersides of their bellies, and that's where they carry their pollen. Dandelions, I hope you leave at least some space for dandelions. We see lots of bees on dandelions. Here's just a tiny little, in comparison, metallic sweat bee that's tucked down into this dandelion, gathering some nectar in there. Okay, some of our early fruit crops. Here's another mining bee, the Andrina. This is probably a male. The males often have more yellow on their faces, or more fuzz, hairy mustaches on their faces, kind of long antennae stand out to me too. So could be a male here. I can't necessarily see whether there's, kind of spindly legs versus hairy legs for pollen collecting. But anyway, these apples and cherries are going to be great places to go and look for bees. Unfortunately, what happens is either you look up and you're like, okay, there's bees, but I can't see who they are. They're moving so quickly. Or we just discount the trees because we really can't focus in and see who's working them. But trees are a great source of pollen and nectar, particularly in spring. Think of those ephemeral wildflowers. There are some of those, but compared to all the trees that are blooming, the willows, the maples, the apples, the cherries, the floral resources in spring are out there on the ends of tree branches. And so the bees are up there like this, blue orchard bee, this osmia, this native osmia. Again, the females have very hairy bellies out there on those early fruit trees in particular. There's actually a researcher at Cornell who has figured out a way to put bee bowls up into tree canopies to collect bees that are in the trees foraging on flowers. because it's hard for us to know as researchers, we can't get up there with nets. How do we know who's up there pollinating those fruit trees? So, our ornamental cherries are non-native, so are our crab apples, but there are native cherries, of course, black cherries and pin cherries, choke cherries. They're all great for bees. Maybe not as easy to see the bees on them, but great floral resources. So we're walking a little bit through the season, right? We started off with those early bulbs and early ephemerals, some of our early trees. Here's a redbud flower. Here's Amy Schnebelin, who she's really prolific on iNaturalist. She's an amazing photographer and worked with Melissa on that bee guide I shared earlier. So this is our polyester bee tucked into that little pea-like flower on the redbud. She's called a polyester bee because she has a gland on her abdomen. She nests in the ground in tunnels, and those little cells that she provisions with pollen from redbud and other flowers, provisions the cells with pollen and nectar, lays her egg, and then uses that gland to secrete a polyester-like substance, a little cellophane bubble, right, to help waterproof her offspring in that cell underground, so that even if it floods, her baby is perfectly protected. Well, maybe not perfectly, but nicely protected underground. So when I see red buds, I think, oh, it's time. The phenology's right? And it's time to go look for some of those polyester bees. What you see in the ground are little mounds that look like anthills, just on sparsely vegetated soil. If there's one individual going in and out, our wasps are later in the season, our social wasps, lots of individuals going in and out of one hole. But early in the season, usually individual bees should be the mining bees, the Andrena, or the polyester or cellophane bees in the genus Caletes. Okay, next in your garden, I want you to plant more monardas, and that can be our any kind of bee balm or monarda, wild bergamot, horse mint. These are all great, in the mint family, so nice nectar source. Here's a little tiny halictus, a little orange-legged furrow bee, collecting resource here, but also great for big bees. We see a lot of bumblebees on monarda. Here's Queen Anne's lace as a stand-in for anybody in the carrot family. So Queen Anne's lace, allowing your parsley that overwintered from last year to bloom, fennel, dill, all of those flowers in the carrot family have very shallow flowers, right? And so very accessible pollen and nectar sources for little tiny bees. So look at this tiny little masked bee, and it's called masked bee because it has color on its face. They don't have long tongues. They can't reach deep down into something like a monarda. They have to just kind of, dap their tongues onto little shallow flowers. And so you tend to get masked bees on something like a carrot. But also you'll get little tiny wasps visiting members of the carrot family. And these can help with some pest management in your yard. So great source, those carrot flowers for beneficial insects like wasps and little flower flies, and also some really little tiny bees like the masked bee. Excuse me. Okay, so how come I haven't really mentioned honeybees? Well, we're talking about bee phenology. Honeybees, their development is not triggered by temperature per se in the spring. They overwinter as adults. They can warm their colony themselves by vibrating their bodies and burning honey to keep warm. And so as long as the day temperature, as long as it's sunny and the temperature is 50 degrees or above, you're going to see honeybees out foraging. So it's a little more, we don't have like an indicator that says, oh, when this blooms, honeybees will be out. It's really like, if it's warm enough for anything to bloom and it's sunny, the honeybees are going to be out. And I just love this picture here that Heidi posted of her bird bath with the honeybees lined up taking a nice drink. So in your bee watcher's garden, it's nice to have a water source for birds and maybe for honeybees or other critters who need a water source. But most bees do not need a water source. They get all the water they need from nectar. But you may want a muddy puddle, and that's what mason bees they'll gather that mason or that mud to seal off little cells in their tunnels. Okay, so we're up to about midsummer. Our squash and our cucumbers, our squash, our gourds, our zucchini are blooming. And here's another specialist bee. This is a squash bee that Peponapis, pepo means squash, apis is bee. And so this is the bee that has to gather pollen from gourds, squash, and pumpkins to provision underground cells for her young. So you'll see this in your flowers, especially that close up at night on your zucchini. The boys might be in there. They kind of buzz if you gently press the flower. And yeah, so a great specialist bee that does also a great job of pollinating. And this is one example of a male bee that actually does a good job of pollinating. The males don't collect pollen on purpose like the females do, but male squash bees hang out in the flowers. And so they just happen to get lots of pollen on their bodies. They visit other flowers because they're looking for the girls, and they actually do a good job of transferring that pollen. Okay, how about some lobelia? A beautiful, particularly the blue lobelia will attract this Anthophora bee, this orange tip wood digger bee. You can just see, I couldn't find a picture that really showed that nice little orange tush on this bee, but the cutest little bee, a native bee. And while they have a season, they actually are active quite a few weeks, but I do see them often on lobelia. So worth including this plant just to try to find this bee. Lots of our Cercium, our thistles, our native thistles are great magnets for bees. Bumblebees love them. There are actually some specialist bees that will visit thistles. And if you don't have the native thistles, even our like our Scotch thistle or weedy thistles are still going to be great for bee watching. Okay, this bee, the wool carder bee, a non-native bee, you can tell that by the name. But they like tall spikes of purple flowers. So think of agastache, your catmint or catnip. Those are, and particularly the blue flowers, you may see them on lamb's ear. So the males will actually guard the flowers. They have little spikes on their bodies that they try to bump into other bees to chase them away. And then the females will actually card the wool from your lamb's ear or other fuzzy leaves, and they use that little ball of fluff to make a nice little nursery cell for their young. Pollen and nectar on that little nursery bed of leaf hairs, and then the egg, and then a few more hairs to finish off that cell. So it looks more like a wasp, not very hairy, very black and yellow on the abdomen. But it is a bee. Purple coneflower, I bet just about everybody in the Zoom room has a purple coneflower. It's a great plant to watch butterflies and bees. Here's a bumblebee. You got a 50-50 chance. Is this a male or a female? And so, you know, we may look at those antennae. It does have kind of long antennae. I don't necessarily see any pollen back here. But the main way to tell that it's a male is that it has a fuzzy yellow mustache. And so those male bumbles have a cute little yellow mustache. And that means that you could gently pluck this bee off the flower and pet him. He can't sting you, right? Because only female bees can sting. Now we're up to goldenrods in bloom. So goldenrods have many specialist bees on them. I think there are 11 or 12 different species of bees that have to have goldenrod, but you'll get so many more bees than just those specialists. You'll get all kinds of, you know, if you don't have a goldenrod, you know what a joy it is just in a meadow to watch the goldenrod, and the skippers are there, and the butterflies and the wasps and the beetles. Everybody's busy around those flowers. And this is a Melissodes or a longhorn. So the horns are the antennae, a longhorn bee that is visiting this goldenrod. Don't forget about ironweed. I mentioned earlier that ironweed has a specialist bee Look at these long hairs on the hind legs. So that's definitely a female, right? The males don't need long hairs because they don't gather pollen. But the female has to visit ironweed. It only takes about 7 individual flowers. So not 7 plants, but just 7 flowers on that plant for her to pack enough pollen to provision 1 cell. Okay, so you don't need an acre of pasture. You don't need a huge meadow like Dawes and other places have, which are amazing, but it can be just 1 ironweed in your backyard. It may eat your backyard because some of them are big, but 1 plant is enough. Asters, again, a great plant to add late in the season. A nice palette, if you will, for photography, right? A nice backdrop, easy to get good photographs on asters. The bees are right there, easy to photograph. And well, I can't really tell. I was going to say probably a male, but there's a little bit of a flattened leg, so it could be a female as well. But we do see lots and lots of male bumblebees late in the season, and that's because that's when the males are needed, when new queens are maturing and emerging from the colony. And that new queen has to find a male, or the male has to find the queen, the virgin queen, and mate with her. And then she is the bumble that overwinters in your backyard, in your compost pile, or underneath your soil. So our last plant here, I don't usually think of my red clovers. I grow red clovers on purpose because they're such a bumblebee magnet. I don't let them go to seed just so I don't have a ton of red clover, but enough to, big, nice globular flower there, easy to watch and photograph, particularly bumbles on. So don't forget about those late season food sources, really important for bumbles in particular, but for other bees to help them get through the winter. So just to remember where we've been, we started here we are early in the spring with our spring bulbs and ephemeral wildflowers, some of those early trees, early weeds. We walked through, our trees are really important late winter, spring, early summer, and then trees are less important for bees. Our perennials start to become more important. Shrubs are really important early summer, midsummer. And then by peak of the summer into fall, it's really those perennial wildflowers that are key for bees. So be sure to include those. I didn't mention mountain mint. It's one of my favorite plants, but also, the goldenrods, the asters, all those DYCs, right? Those difficult composites to ID, really, really important for bees. Okay. So I am going to stop there. I'm going to stop sharing.
That was
I'll leave that up in case.
fantastic. I really enjoyed it. My favorite of the specialist bees, I have to admit, is the Melissoides on the ironweed. Ironweed is one of my favorite plants just because of how beautiful. If you really take a look at ironweed and really get close up, it's sort of that giant inflorescence, but if you really get in there, you can see how delicate it is. And I've been fortunate enough to see several Melissoides on the ironweed, and that's the first bee I learned from Denise was the Melissoides and the ironweed. And one of my favorites, I know I have a little patch of ironweed that I've convinced the apartment complex that it's not a weed, it's a beautiful flower that I've planted here. It came up on its own, but I'm keeping it. And so beautiful, beautiful. Thank you, Denise. I learned so much. This was fabulous. Every time I learn a new bee.
So Holly, I'm glad you mentioned the ironweed because there is a cultivar and we're doing some cultivar demonstration gardens this year. And we're using this one to contrast with the straight species. So some people are like, I only want straight species, and that's fine. But if you don't have room for a plant that's 8 or 10 feet tall, you might go with iron butterfly, and that's a much tighter, it's still a native, it's not an Ohio native, but it's a much tighter, maybe 3 foot tall ironweed. You'll still get those Melissoides longhorn bees visiting them. They have this in a really nice patch at Holden Arboretum, and I just fell in love with this cultivar, so maybe one to try.
Absolutely. I have to get my hands on some of that. Yes. Every time I learn a new bee from Denise, and I know if you're like me, there's a lot of bees, and so you could get a little overwhelmed. And so I try to learn one new bee each time.
you
And
go.
so this is great. Thank you so much, Denise. Does anybody have any questions for Denise? She is just such a wealth of knowledge. You can go ahead and put them in our chat or unmute yourself. That we can do that as well.
Oh, Kathleen wondered if I'm related to Mr. Ellsworth, a biology teacher at Oakwood High School in Stark County. So there are lots of Ellsworths, Kathleen, in Stark County, but not, not related to me.
And Kathleen says, I tried adding a picture of a bee on a crocus, took yesterday an iNaturalist, but it only names the crocus. Will it see the bee? Do you have any tips for that?
So yeah, so I think you have to go back in and add it as another observation and put that in as you know, what you're identifying it as. Because yeah, it is tricky if you let it use AI to identify what's on there. It may, you know, pick the flower and not pick the bee. So I think you can put in, if you think it's a bumble, just pick genus Bombus, and then it'll go up.
Sounds great. And then the recording today will be posted on Wild Ones Columbus website, as well as our Facebook page will have a link to it as well. And you can have access to the slides that way.
I was gonna say, and Holly, I'm happy to share a PDF of the PowerPoint if that's helpful to.
Okay, yeah. I think the video should be just fine.
Okay.
Thank you all so much for attending.
I love it. Somebody's clock is chiming and it's time to go.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. I've had so much fun learning our bees with you. Thank you again to Denise.
Thanks,
and
Yes.
run and get that shot for your husband. Have a great Saturday, everyone. I hope you can get out and at least see some crocuses. Thank you, everyone. Have a great
Bye.
day.
Thanks all. Thanks, Holly.
Thank you for our program committee. It's fabulous, the programs you're doing.
Thank you so much. I would greatly appreciate that.
Okay, take care.
Yeah.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks a lot.